and welcome all to the keynote address of Professor Alasdair MacIntyre for the Common Good as Common Project Conference. We would first like to thank the University of Notre Dame Law School and especially Professor Rick Garnett for making this beautiful room available to us. We are grateful for their support and their help. And now I would like to introduce the moderator for this talk, Professor Michael Moreland, who is a visiting professor of law at Notre Dame Law School and who regularly teaches law at Villanova University.
Thank you, Father Justin. As I was thinking about my introduction for today, I had in front of me two facts. One is that if you're attending a conference on the common good at Notre Dame, you surely know who Alasdair MacIntyre is already. And second, I know that Alasdair does not like long introductions. So I will keep it brief. It's been a special honor to have had Alasdair MacIntyre as a teacher when I was an undergraduate here, and now to be a colleague of his at the Center for Ethics and Culture, where I'm a visiting fellow and where he is senior research fellow. You all know the highlights of his remarkable career as a moral and political philosopher. I should note two especially noteworthy things. First, he's the author of After Virtue in 1981, and in 2012 he received Villanova University's Civitas Dei Medal. But without any further ado, I present to you Alasdair MacIntyre.
Let me begin with three apologies. The first is to those on whose ideas I shall be drawing in this paper without acknowledgement. The acknowledgements are in the written version. Scholarship has been defined as plagiarism plus footnotes, and I'm leaving out the footnotes. The second apology is to those critics of earlier writings of mine on the common good. It may appear that I've taken no notice of their criticisms. That's not so, but I wanted to apologize for the lack of explicit attention. And the third apology is to you, because you've been talking about the common good for nearly 24 hours, and now I suddenly arrive and take you right back to the beginning. But I have to do this because the structure of my argument demands it. What I assert in the second part of the paper presupposes the truth of what I assert in the first part. What I assert in the third and later parts presupposes what I assert in the first and second parts. So forgive me for beginning with things perhaps too elementary. As everyday agents, we all recognize a distinction between common goods and other types of good. There are goods that I as an individual can set myself to achieve and enjoy as an individual. Indeed, that I can enjoy only as an individual. So it is with the pleasure that I take in the taste of oysters and Guinness stout on my palate, or that you take in the taste of smoked salmon and Lafroig malt whisky on yours. By contrast, there are goods that I can only achieve and enjoy as a member of a family, as someone's child and someone else's parent, or as a performer in an orchestra, as second violin, or as percussionist. The goods of family life and the goods of performing and enjoying performing great orchestral works are common goods. But this distinction between common goods and individual goods is not the only distinction that we make. There are many individual goods that we may enjoy as individuals and can enjoy only as individuals, but that we can achieve only through cooperation with others. I have in mind here not that incidental cooperation with others involved even in consuming oysters and Guinness. What I have in mind, rather, are those cases where I and others cooperate, setting ourselves a common goal, but only so that each of us may benefit as an individual. So I and my neighbours may cooperate in having someone to work in our yards. None of us individually could afford to hire such a person, and each of us is interested only in having work done in her or his yard. By so cooperating, however, each of us achieves and enjoys an individual good. But now we need to make a further distinction between different types of cooperatively achieved individual goods. The achievement of some such goods is so important for the making and sustaining of social life that it became necessary for government to invoke its authority and employ its resources in order to achieve them. So it has been with the building of roads, with the provision of clean water, and with maintaining an educational system. Most individuals want the benefits of these. Few individuals or groups of individuals are able to pay the costs. And so these goods have to be provided by local or national governments and paid for by taxation. Let us call these public goods. Some contemporary political rhetoric blurs the distinction between public goods and common goods, since politicians advocating the achievement of some public good often claim to be acting for the common good, as if public goods and common goods were one and the same, which they are not. It is, however, the case that the common goods of families and households, say, or of workplaces, can often be achieved only if certain public goods are provided, clean water, for example, or education into certain skills. So the achievement of public goods and the achievement of common goods are not always unrelated. And it's only when we begin to pose questions about such relationships that we're able to recognize some of the complexities in the relationships between the different types of good that we've distinguished. So everyday agents find themselves posing and answering at least three different kinds of question. First of all, family members or participants in a workplace or members of a string quartet may find themselves asking, if we were to act so as to achieve our common good in these particular circumstances, how would we be acting? That is, they ask what it is to find application for the concept of a common good in their everyday lives. Secondly, individual agents, whatever the common or individual goods that they aim to achieve, can't but ask and answer the questions, what place am I going to give to the pursuit of this or that particular good in my life? And how am I going to rank order goods in making my choices? And thirdly, both individual agents and agents deliberating together as family members or colleagues in a workplace or whatever have reason to ask, what do we owe to others by way of collaboration with them in achieving the provision of public goods? These three kinds of question need to be distinguished, but it's generally impossible to give an answer to a question of any one of these kinds without also answering questions of the other two kinds. Note that these questions are such that, if we answer them mistakenly, we're apt to bring about not goods but evils. Note, too, that these are not initially philosophers' questions, but questions the asking and answering of which is part of the fabric of everyday social and political life. Yet it's often difficult to formulate anything like adequate answers to them without philosophical reflection. So what do we learn from philosophers? And now I move to the second part of the paper. I begin with Aristotle. What we have to learn from Aristotle is in part a matter of what he affirms, in part a matter of what he denies or ignores. Human beings without a polis, that is, a political society of the kind exemplified by the Greek city-state, will not, on Aristotle's account, be genuinely human, but rather beasts or gods. They will not exercise the powers specific to rational animals, since we learn how to exercise those powers in and through deliberating with our fellow citizens. What we deliberate about with them, when we deliberate well, is the common good of our particular polis, our particular city, a good not peculiarly mine nor yours, but peculiarly its and ours. Aristotle insists that the good of the polis is a greater good than that of the individual citizen, the good of the whole a greater good than that of the parts. But he doesn't mean that individual citizens have to subordinate their individual goods to the good of the polis. It's rather through acting together to achieve the common good of the polis that they achieve their own individual goods, goods that are in part political, but that include a further good that transcends politics, the good of the philosophical or contemplative life. What then is it for citizens to deliberate together well about their political common good? The contrast is with deliberation aimed at achieving advantage for one's own partial and partisan interest. Translated into contemporary terms, the contrast is with political debate understood as a form of bargaining between representatives of rival interests. There is, say, a proposal to build a major highway through a city. Such a road would benefit some local industry by lowering transport costs, and a firm that had considered moving elsewhere would stay, thus preserving jobs. But the building of that road would involve the destruction of a middle-class neighbourhood and a school. The homeowners have no wish to move, and the children would have their education disrupted. It would also make one of the few local parks available for sports teams inaccessible. So, in a politics of interests, industrial owners and managers and trade unionists would be matched against homeowners and sports enthusiasts. Actual cases are characteristically a good deal more complex, and I recommend to you the study of two of them. One, that of the proposal in the late 1940s, 50s, and 60s to build the Southwest Expressway in Boston, about which there is a good book that was written actually before the proposal was finally abandoned. And secondly, what I take to be one of the great classics of modern political study, Bent Theuberg's Rationality and Power, which is about the resiting and remaking of the bus station in Aalborg, Denmark, and which is one of the great epic tales of politics. What in almost all modern society, in almost all modern contexts, would be missing from such debates would be any shared answer to the question, what kind of city would we have to inhabit if our common good were to be achieved? An adequate answer to that question would appeal to some conception of how homes, workplaces, and schools are best related geographically and architecturally, some conception of what provision needs to be made for those practices participation in which contributes to human flourishing, such as music, theatre, and other arts, such as football and other sports, and above all, some conception of how citizens can best be educated so that they are able to contribute to the city's shared decision-making. A city is a rational community only insofar as its decision-making presupposes a significant degree of rationally justifiable agreement on these and related issues, that is, on how the city's common good is to be understood. But to this it will be at once objected, and rightly, that this is in important respects not an Aristotelian way of understanding the common good. Indeed, it isn't. And were it to be spelt out further, this would become increasingly clear. For in giving any justifiable contemporary account of the common good of political society, I will have to take into consideration the common goods of the households in which its citizens live and of the workplaces in which its citizens work. But about their common goods, Aristotle is almost silent, even though he recognizes that it is for the common good of political society that in households and workplaces people should live well. Every community is for the sake of some good. Nonetheless, Aristotle's view of things does seem to preclude there being any such thing as the common good of a household or of a workplace, about which the members of that household or workplace might deliberate together, since this would involve an exercise of rationality that is, on Aristotle's view, impossible for women by reason of their nature, and for productive workers by reason of their occupation. Since about this Aristotle is plainly and absurdly mistaken, we can only rescue Aristotle from himself if we can amend his account of the common good of political society so that it finds a place for the common goods of household and workplace. And just as, on Aristotle's view, those relationships in political society that are ordered towards the common good must be informed by justice, so on the view that I'm proposing, justice in the relationships of home and household and of the workplace is also required if these latter common goods are to be achieved. We can then defend anything like an Aristotelian account of the political common good in contemporary terms only if we adopt a stance in some respects at odds with Aristotle's own. It should also already be evident that, except in rare cases, a contemporary political society structured by an Aristotelian understanding of its common good will not take the form of a modern state, if only because almost all modern states are too large and heterogeneous, are oligarchies ruled by agenda-setting elites, and are bureaucratically structured so that the relationship of those who govern to the governed is too often that of patron to client rather than that of citizen to citizen. This, however, does not preclude the emergence of local societies who, deliberating together as to their common good and sharing an understanding of their needs and resources, bring into being recognizably Aristotelian forms of local political community in neighborhoods, in townships, even in some cities, even perhaps in some small nation states. Within such groups, a type of politics may develop through which demands for resources and opportunities are formulated, demands for the attention and the responses of the representatives of the state, demands for public goods that contribute to the achievement of local common goods. All these demands are formulated and advanced. So it can be when local community groups resist school closings or take action to secure affordable housing. What then might we take ourselves to have learnt from Aristotle? First, that it's only through deliberating with fellow citizens as to what our political common good is and how to achieve it that we realize our potentialities as rational agents. And secondly, that it's through thus learning how to identify and achieve our political common good that we learn how to rank order goods, whether individual or common, more generally. We might and should conclude, thirdly, that we can only become thus educated if we become able to judge and act justly. But it's not possible to judge and act justly without possessing some measure of the other virtues of courage, temperateness, and especially practical intelligence, phronesis. So a political education that enables us to act for the sake of the common good will have to have been an education into the virtues. But if this is what we're inclined to say, we should note that if these three theses are true, we could not have learnt them from Aristotle or from any other theorist. We could only have learnt their truth in and through practice and critical reflection on practice. Any philosophical account of them, by Aristotle or anyone else, is to be judged as an articulation of good practice. What this development of Aristotle's position suggests is a disquieting conclusion. We need to be educated into and to participate in a politics of the common good if we are to develop our full human potentialities. But the dominant forms of contemporary political life provide no such education. How then should we think about our condition? A first step is to consider another and very different perspective on Aristotle, that provided by Aquinas. On Aquinas' view, Aristotle's account is importantly incomplete, yet Aristotle provides the right starting point. So, in Aquinas' commentary on the Politics, he endorsed Aristotle's account of the political common good. Yet that political good turns out to be a subordinate good since, and I quote, "The highest good, which is God, is the common good, since the good of all things depends on him, and the good whereby each thing is good is the particular good of it and of other things which depend on it. Everything, therefore, is ordered to one good, which is God, as to an end. As part of the political community, I find a less than ultimate good in the good of my political community. As part of the universe, I find my ultimate good in the good of the universe, God. For I am part of the order of things, and the goods to the achievement of which I direct myself are rightly ordered only when they are ordered to God. But what then is the relationship between the parts that we play as members of a political community and the parts that we play as participants in the order of things? Two complementary notions are key, those of law and of the virtues. The relationship of each of us to every other is defined by that law whose precepts we are aware of as rational agents, the natural law. So I encounter every other human agent, no matter how much a stranger, no matter how strange a stranger, as someone with whom I share a common good, and with whom I must deliberate as to what the achievement of that good requires and how to achieve it. And it is that same law which, when it finds expression in the positive law of a particular political community, defines the relationships of citizens to each other so that they are directed towards their political common good. But how are we to become the kind of agent who directs her or himself both to her or his ultimate good and to such subordinate goods as the good of political community? Only by being educated into the exercise of the virtues of justice, courage, and temperateness, and that practical intelligence which Aristotle called phronesis, Aquinas names prudentia or prudence. So a key relationship for Aquinas as for Aristotle is that between common goods and virtues. About this relationship, several things need to be said. The first is to reiterate that we won't understand this relationship in our theorizing if we haven't first understood it as integral to our practical lives. What it is to become the kind of agent who is responsive to whatever it is that on this or that occasion justice or courageous risk-taking or disciplined appetites require of us, if we are to achieve some common good, has to be learnt from teachers and exemplars who know how to communicate this kind of responsiveness to others through the habits of a common life. Secondly, it's important that this kind of education into the virtues involves a transformation of the agent's desires. Those who address some call for obedience to precepts of the natural law, or to any other set of precepts, to those whose desires have not yet been adequately transformed, become the voices of an ineffective abstract moralism, a moralism all too familiar in recent American politics. Thirdly, it's of crucial importance that those who on particular occasions act rightly in choosing to achieve this particular good, common or otherwise, rather than that, will also have acted rightly in directing themselves towards the achievement of their ultimate good, that is, God. So an education into the virtues is such as to elicit not only desires for our particular finite individual and common goods, but also a desire for that which lies beyond all finite goods. Or so we seem to be instructed by Aquinas' account. But at this point, someone will surely remark that none of this seems to be true. For if it were true, we would inhabit a universe more or less evidently ordered both to a range of subordinate individual and common goods and to God as its final good, the common good of every part of that universe. While, in observable fact, we inhabit a universe of many and multifarious evils, among them those evils resulting from the wrongdoing of agents who take themselves to be free to pursue whatever goods they will at whatever costs they are prepared to pay or to inflict on others. Those impressed by this objection are generally surprised to learn that it's just those evils which Aquinas' account is designed to explain. When in Book 3 of the Summa Contra Gentiles, he arrives at the conclusion that God is the common good of the universe and the end of all things, it's the outcome of an extended argument in the preceding chapters addressed to the question, what is it that makes evil possible? That there are evils, Aquinas has no doubt, and he provides a variety of examples. But various as these examples are, it's true of each and all of them that they can only be characterized with reference to some good. Evil is intelligible as and only as a defect, a lack of something or a failure of something that, were it not lacking or were it not failing, but functioning well, would be constitutive of the goodness of whatever it is that is bad. Evil in human agents, so Aquinas concludes, and I conclude with him, is intelligible as and only as lack, failure, defectiveness in directedness towards the common good and the final good of every agent God. And often enough, such defect is the result of some failure to identify and pursue subordinate common goods, including the common goods of political societies, that is, some failure in apprehending what law and justice require, or some failure in caring about law and justice. Why is this important for my present argument? I've stressed that for both Aristotle and Aquinas, it's only in and through practice that we learn how to direct ourselves rightly towards the achievement of common goods. But we now need to take note that theoretical misconceptions or confusions may on occasion mislead us as to what good practice requires. And among these are misconceptions and confusions about the place of evil in human life. For it's not just that we need to direct ourselves towards our common goods if we are to achieve that good which is specific to our nature, but that in order to do so, we need to be aware of and give full weight to the liability and vulnerability to evil that we and others share. About this liability and vulnerability, Charles de Koninck reiterated Aquinas' thesis that they put at risk not only our ability to achieve our ends, our individual and common goods, but also our worth as human beings, as rational agents, our human dignity. Aquinas had written that, I quote, "The human by sinning departs from the order of reason, and by so doing falls from human dignity, which consists in this, that the human is naturally free and exists for its own sake, and in a certain way falls into the servitude of non-human animals. For a bad human is worse than a non-human animal." De Koninck shows how crucial our failures to relate rightly to our common goods are in this loss of our dignity. What gives us the worth that we have is our potentiality as rational agents to achieve the ends and goods proper to rational agents. What endangers that worth is the range of ways in which we may frustrate ourselves and others in our pursuit of those ends and goods. For, as de Koninck, following Aquinas, makes clear, it's not only that we may rank order goods wrongly, so that we don't give, say, the common good of political society its due place, but also that we may care about that common good, not because and insofar as it is a good, but because it is my or our good, not theirs. So the study of politics is, among other things, but importantly, a study of just those evils that are brought about in the course of and as a result of the pursuit of the common good, a remarkably common set of evils. About this, a good deal more needs to be said, but before beginning to say it, we need to identify one possible source of confusion in thinking about these matters: the assertions concerning the common good in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Non-Catholics can go to sleep for the next few minutes. I'm just going to talk about the Catechism in a way that could really only interest keen readers of the Catechism. Paragraphs 1905 to 1912 of the Catechism provide a statement of the Church's teaching on the common good, a statement which at a number of points follows the wording of Gaudium et Spes. With it, we seem to have entered a new conceptual world, in which concepts of the human person, of respect for the dignity of the human person, and of the fundamental and inalienable rights of the human person have a central place, one for which there is no precedent in Aristotle's or Aquinas' discussion of the common good. Indeed, at first sight, this statement appears to be in some respects incompatible with what we had learned, or thought we had learned, from de Koning. De Koning insisted that an understanding of their common good is a prerequisite for any adequate understanding of human beings, while the Catechism asserts of the common good that, and I quote, it can be defined only in reference to the human person, as though we must already have understood what human beings are prior to any understanding of their common good. So the Catechism lists as the first of three essential elements of the common good respect for the person as such, the person who has inalienable human rights. What then are we to make of these differences between the Catechism on the one hand and Aquinas as understood by de Koning on the other, both in idiom and apparently in substance? What are we to make of this appeal to some notion of the dignity of the human person as fundamental? It was first Emmanuel Mounier and other contributors to the journal Esprit, and then Jacques Maritain, who used the word person as the Catechism does. But we need to remind ourselves that Maritain introduced his use of the word by reiterating two of Aquinas' theses. Human beings as rational agents, unlike members of other species, are willed and loved by God for their own sake. And they have God not only as their ultimate common good, but as their final end, their beatitude. It's in virtue of these characteristics that human beings have the peculiar worth that they have and are to be spoken of as persons. It's from this same conception that the Catechism begins, when it first speaks of the dignity of human beings as deriving from their being called to and created for communion with God. This is as early as paragraph 27, and later draws out the consequences of this theological conception of human worth. It's then perhaps saying in its later thesis about the definition of the common good in paragraph 1905, no more than that, when we come to speak of the common good of human beings, we must first characterize it as a good of human beings thus conceived. So, in fact, agreeing with de Koning. Paragraph 1924 proceeds to tell us what the political and social common good is by quoting Gaudium et Spes. It's, quote, the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. And paragraph 1925 goes on to identify as among the essential elements of such fulfillment respect for the fundamental rights of the person, those rights that had been earlier called inalienable. It is then perhaps not too difficult to present the teaching of the Catechism on the common good in terms that render it compatible with the views that I have ascribed to Aristotle and to Aquinas, as understood by de Koning. Where the Catechism speaks of human beings as persons, we can instead follow Aquinas in speaking of them as rational agents, with both the ends and the relationships of rational agents. Where the Catechism speaks of fundamental inalienable rights, we can instead follow Aquinas in speaking instead of what justice requires. And where the Catechism speaks of the state, we need only turn to its Latin text to discover that the state is a translation of civitas, Aquinas' translation of Aristotle's polis. The apparent differences in substance are not, after all, real differences. What remains, however, are striking differences in idiom, style, and rhetoric. And differences in idiom, style, and rhetoric are of quite considerable importance in politics. What that idiom, style, and rhetoric may conceal from us is the extent of the difference between the types of political society in which Aristotle and Aquinas found application for the concept of a common good, and the kind of political society that we now inhabit. I suggested earlier that except in rare cases, the sheer size of modern states and the heterogeneity of their institutions make it difficult to understand what the common good of its citizens might consist in. When threatened by an external invader with aggressive intentions, it will indeed generally be to the good of all of them to defend themselves against such an invader. And insofar as the state provides security from the criminals among their fellow citizens, it's to the good of all of them that it should continue to do so. But these, as Hobbes understood at the outset, are individual goods secured by collective action. What the modern state supplies are public goods of great importance, public goods without which a variety of common goods couldn't be achieved. So it is too with the welfare and educational goods that it supplies. What the state does not supply is a genuinely common good for all its citizens. The justification that the state is able to advance for its right to govern is indeed that it provides this range of necessary public goods. And this is in most circumstances a compelling justification. Moreover, as I also suggested earlier, these same goods may on occasion be appropriated as resources needed to achieve their common goods by local political societies. So a particular local community may understand that only if its children and adolescents are adequately educated can it be sustained as an adequately deliberative community, arriving at shared decisions on what its common good is, including decisions on its communal responsibility for the very old and the very young. And it may find ways of engaging in the politics of the state that enables it to provide the educational resources that it needs. Modern states themselves can't be adequately deliberative communities, and not only because of their size and heterogeneity, which I mentioned earlier. It's also the case, as I also noticed earlier, that they are ruled by agenda-setting elites, political elites, financial elites, economic elites, media elites, academic elites, who make public debates a matter of choice between severely limited and unimaginative alternatives, so excluding many voices that go unheard. But this isn't all. Economic inequalities in modern societies are such that appeals to interests are bound for a large majority to be more persuasive than appeals to the common good, even when those appeals to interest are masked by a rhetoric that appeals to the common good. The everyday anxieties of the unemployed and of most working-class people dictate a politics of interests, while about the rich we need always to remember Aristotle's remark that they do not know how to be ruled. Moreover, the different ways in which different social groups are educated or miseducated make it impossible for them to engage in the kind of shared deliberative conversations from which a common mind concerning the common good can emerge. Some are scarcely educated at all. Some are unable to recognize the extent to which they can become victims of misinformation communicated by the social media. Some trust expertise unduly, and some mistrust it unduly. So there are insufficiently common standards in the light of which truth is judged and arguments evaluated. But without these, it must seem that no common mind as to the common good is possible. However, this is a mistake. Those who are concerned to achieve the common goods, either of their households or of their workplaces or of their schools, recurrently discover the interdependence of these common goods. Families have difficulty in flourishing when the parents cannot earn a decent wage in the workplace. Students find it difficult to learn when their family life is defective. Workplaces need workers who are well educated, so that from time to time those who inhabit a particular neighborhood, town or city will mobilize themselves so that they can secure the resources that they need and distribute them justly. To do this, they have to identify their shared political common good and work together to achieve it. Often enough, the beginnings of such politics are a response to some inflicted deprivation. The closing down of a workplace with subsequent unemployment, the closing down of a school that has been a center for community life, a rise in violent crime. And the organizations involved may be correspondingly various. Trade union branches, parent-teacher associations, cooperative enterprises, churches, community organizations of the type fostered by Jacques Maritain's friend Saul Alinsky. But it's also the case that sometimes through the processes of normal municipal politics, some cities, their citizens and their local governments, may over time develop a consensus about their city's common good, which they then pursue. What we have in both cases are sets of individuals who are committed to achieving their local common goods, moving into engagement with the politics of the state, giving whatever is due from them and their communities to the institutions of the state, in order to receive in return the opportunities and the resources that their communities need if they're to flourish. So one measure of a modern state is supplied by asking and answering the question, how does it contribute to or fail to contribute to the flourishing of its local communities by the ways in which it distributes opportunities and resources? It's the quality of life in Englewood or Mishawaka by which the governments in Washington, D.C. and Indianapolis are to be judged. To have understood this enables us to understand the relevance of the Catechism's precepts concerning the political common good. Those precepts state requirements that both citizens and agents of government must satisfy if the state is to provide the opportunities and resources needed for local communities to achieve their political common goods. That the style, idiom, and rhetoric of the Catechism is the style, idiom, and rhetoric of contemporary political debate is therefore to be welcomed at one level, for how otherwise could its voice be heard? Whether its voice is heard or not will be reflected not only in government's decisions about public goods, but also in those considerations that are given weight in governmental decision-making, in how far a regard for local community provides reason for government to dispose of its opportunities and resources in one way rather than another. If, to return to an earlier example, new roads are to be built or existing transport facilities enlarged, what weight will be given to the effects on local community life, to whether it will be enhanced or threatened by the proposed change? To have a care for the political common good in contemporary terms is to be guided in decision-making about public goods by how such questions are answered. Note that such a care for the political common good will on occasion result in conflict with the protagonists of economic growth and technological progress. If by introducing new machines that displace workers, so increasing productivity, reducing costs, and increasing the gross domestic product, firms create significant local unemployment with destructive effects on those relationships that sustain local communal life, then those with a care for the political common good will act to prevent this happening. To have a care for the common good may well result in becoming a Luddite. But it's not enough to spell out what it is to take the common good as a standard, a task at which we've so far only gestured. We need also to understand why, in situations in which the common good is at stake, the political outcomes are what they are. Why, to return to our examples, did things in the end go well in Boston and badly in Aalborg? Part of the answer will, of course, concern the workings of political and other institutions and the constraints on action imposed by such institutions. But part of it will concern the individuals who made and implemented the relevant decisions and why they acted as they did. And here we need to remind ourselves once again of the political dimension of the virtues. Because a human being is by nature a political animal, wrote Aquinas, the virtues that are human beings by nature are called political, since by them a human being is rightly ordered regarding the conduct of human affairs. And we earlier noted the place that each of the cardinal virtues has in achieving the political common good. For if the common good is to be achieved, temperateness will be required so that self or group-interested desires do not unduly influence decision-making, courage in order to withstand the pressure of this or that sectional interest against the common good, justice so that each community and each part of the community receives its due, and prudence in setting priorities and using available resources. But once it's clear that in modern states, those with the virtues are a good deal less likely than most to achieve high office, for an ability and a willingness to represent particular interests effectively are in general prerequisites for achieving such office, so that it might seem that any conception of an effective politics of the common good will have a severely limited application. Yet, if Aquinas is right, those who defect from or oppose the achievement of the political common good act in ways that are at odds with their own human nature, so that from time to time they may find themselves open to considerations other than those that are given weight by the interests that they represent. Moral and political inconsistency may open up unexpected possibilities, and knowing how to take advantage of such possibilities is part of the work of the virtue of prudence. More often, particular distributions of opportunities and resources by central governments, whether in infrastructure or in education or in job creation, may provide local organizations with means to sustain or strengthen local community without this having been any part of central government's intentions. And it's important not to forget how much non-governmental institutions, ranging from Catholic schools and Catholic worker houses to the Salvation Army, all of them not only material providers, but educators into at least some of the virtues, contribute to local community. So that there is a good deal less warrant than we might have thought for pessimism about the prospects of a politics of the common good. Nonetheless, someone may say, such a politics, always local and limited, is a small part of politics as understood and practiced in modern nation states, of politics as studied in political science departments. And such a one may go on to ask whether it does not follow from the view that I've taken that any substantive conception of a common political good is therefore irrelevant to the study of politics as it's carried on in such departments. The answer is no, for it's only when we understand contemporary politics in the light afforded by a substantive conception of the political common good that we are able to understand it as what it is, a systematically defective form of human activity, one that cannot but value qualities quite other than the virtues. It's in key part because the agents of contemporary politics so often act and cannot but act in ways uninformed by any conception of the common political good, that they become the agents of frequent evils. Consider as a prime example the frequent failures of modern states to discharge their responsibilities towards the children who reside in their territory. It's of the first importance for the common good that local communities should take responsibility for all their children, and for each child from conception to adult life, primarily by securing for all parents and teachers the resources that they need to provide every child with at least an adequate family life and at least an adequate education. So the political question is, how do we bring it about so that productive opportunities and the resources available for consumption are so organized that these ends are achieved? It's not that the agents of modern politics give a wrong answer to this question. They almost never ask it, and they generally have no way of asking it within the confines of established political discourse. Because they have no way of asking it, they are in a way not individually culpable, but in failing to ask it, they become agents of frequent evils. Much political history is written as a history of progress, and so it should be. Political activity issuing governmental action has achieved great goods. But far too often, the benefits of social, economic, and political progress are achieved at the expense of some significant section of society who are not consulted and yet made to pay the costs of that progress, so that questions of justice arise and the common good is ignored. Here, the characteristically unasked questions are, on whom will the costs of progress be inflicted, and who will be excluded from enjoying its benefits? Here again, failure to ask these questions results in frequent evils. My large claim then is that for modern nation states above a certain size, and except in certain special conditions, the politics of those states, as a defective form of human activity, inescapably generates evils, something that those engaged in such political activity are too often unable to acknowledge. Hence derives the pathos of that literary genre, the self-congratulatory memoir, to which successful politicians sometimes devote their retirement. Much of modern politics is inescapably an area of moral ambiguity, so that it's always insufficient to be right-minded, to be committed to whatever set of principles is approved in the social milieu in which one moves, whatever those principles are. But it's worse still to congratulate oneself on having been right-minded. We need then an adequate conception of the political common good for both evaluative and explanatory purposes. Neither purpose has been adequately served so far by academic political science, but its explanatory failures are at least as notable as its evaluative failures. Both are exemplified in its lack of recognition of both the source and the extent of political evils.
We have until 3:15 for questions to Professor MacIntyre.
I've asked the first question almost every session, so I'm going to continue on my tradition. I would like to ask you, Professor, about your, a couple of times, especially in the first couple of sections, the sections 1 and 2, and maybe also 3, you talked about the political common good or political activity as being about rank ordering goods.
Including rank. To identify the...
I wanted to just ask about the idea of rank ordering goods. Because we rarely see, or we hardly ever see anywhere, a real sort of full rank ordering of something, through however many there, for delineating what those goods might be and then rank ordering them. So I was wondering, where does that come? Does that simply come out of when you have two goods that are indirectly in conflict, and have to choose them, we choose the one that's higher in rank or something like that? How does this rank ordering, how do you understand that as working out? That sounds...
Well, one conceptual point first. We may well rank order goods as being of greater or lesser importance in a general way, but when we make decisions, it's just not true that we should always pursue that pursuing what would be the greater good on such a list would be the right thing for us to do for us. Aquinas says it's very important from time to time to take time off to make jokes in casual conversation. This is something we need, right? And sometimes if I have to choose between casual conversation and pursuing an important philosophical argument, what I ought to do is pursue casual conversation, okay? So rank ordering has its complexities. But now in politics, let's take one large question. It's very notable in the United States that old people are treated much better than children. The United States, on a spectrum, comes out here with, why is this? Old people are very good at lobbying, note the AARP, right? And therefore, although there's a lot wrong with the way old people are treated, they tend, when contrasted with children, to do badly. This isn't always true. And it seems to be very important that when one thinks about how resources should be allocated in terms of old people and children, it's very important to think about this together. What you want for children, what you want for old people, so that rank ordering becomes important when you have limited resources and you have to decide how to allocate them. Let me give you one example of a very good way to allocate resources here. In Scotland, old people who need such care are treated free. There are care centres where they go and live, and they are well looked after, and the majority of the people who look after them are working class women in later middle age. How does this happen? How does it work? It became very clear that families are not able to cope with old people that have dementia, old people that have certain physical disabilities that they need communal care, so provision of homes. But this sounds very expensive. And then someone hit on the bright idea that it would be very good if, although you had on hand trained physicians and nurses, a great deal of the care was given by ordinary people who had had some training. And in particular, working class women in their late 40s, their children have grown up and left home. They themselves may have worked, but at this point they're looking, very many of them are looking for something to do. And this provided an occupation. And what's very interesting is the caregivers love their occupation. They turn out to be very good at it. I visited relatives in 2 of those homes. Now it turns out that providing such care is actually cheaper than allowing old people to be hospitalized when they have to be finally. It turns out people didn't sit down and say, what is the cheapest way you can find in doing this? But it turned out this was a very good way to do it economically. And it involved not merely caring for the old people, but providing an interesting and constructive occupation for a group of people who wouldn't otherwise have it. They got wages. This increases the economic well-being of their community and so on. I take it this was a very good piece of social thinking because it didn't think about old people alone, but also about the various people who would be working. And in a similar way, people thinking about how children should be looked after very often do better to think not only about children, but at the same time about their parents, about family life, and so on. I give you an example which is not a result of any kind of social planning. When I was first teaching, I lived in a town called Hyde, which was one of the southernmost of the cotton towns. And this was in the decade before, this was in the late 1940s, early 50s, before the textile industry had collapsed as a result of American competition. In the textile towns, in the cotton towns, working class families were 3-generation families. When a couple would get married around the age of 19, 20, 21, the woman would have her first child, and after she had looked after it for a few weeks, she would go back to work in the mill, and the child would be brought up either by her parents or by her husband's parents. It was the grandparents who brought up the children. This worked extremely well. It turns out grandparents are much better at bringing up children than parents are. They are much less afflicted by anxiety. They enjoy the children much more. And this turned out to be wonderful. Children, when they came back from school, always had somebody to look after them. There were often tensions as to which set of grandparents would look after which children. Things had to be worked out. But you had 2 sets of wages coming into the household. And so people were much better off than they would otherwise have been. And you had this very flourishing form of working class life. With, I may say also, a huge interest by the grandparents in how their children did at school. Because they had time to spend thinking about these things in a way that the parents didn't. Now, this was a way of providing old people with an occupation and children with care. It worked extremely well. When the textile industry collapsed and the parents' generation had to go elsewhere to find work, and there just wasn't 3-generation housing. It's quite different. The result was that for 2 or 3 years there was a high suicide rate among people aged in their 60s because the role that they had looked forward to having was taken away from. So what I'm talking about rank ordering goods, I'm talking about thinking about not choosing between resources, prioritizing resources as going to this rather than that in an abstract way, but us getting a larger picture. And this is something that characteristically in political decision making doesn't happen. Does that begin to answer your question?
How does the pursuit of common goods change when it is in entities like schools and workplaces that are not as fundamental as like families or cities?
With workplaces, it obviously differs a tremendous amount and depends on all sorts of things. But I'll give you one example. It was often there was a certain stage in automobile manufacture when Japanese automobile manufacturers were thought to have a hidden secret because they were able to produce cars of a quality and at a speed that American manufacturers couldn't match. The joke was that these Japanese manufacturers had learned this from Americans. What did Japanese car manufacturers did? Well, up till this time in Japanese, we're now talking about the late 1940s, early 50s. Up till this time in Japanese factories, like in American factories, workers worked on some particular part of the car, and when they'd worked on this particular part, the car that was in the making moved on and somebody else worked on the next part and so on. And at the same time, you had quality inspectors, people who went round the factory making sure that the workers were doing it right and censuring them if they didn't, and generally adopting a managerial attitude. What the Japanese learned to do was, first of all, to stop having workers work only on one part of the car, but a team of workers would be given the task of producing the whole car. And producing that car as efficiently, as quickly, and also of as high a quality as possible. And they took away the quality inspectors. It became a matter of pride. They became people who were practicing a craft. It transformed the attitudes of the workers. There were changes made in pay structures to reflect this, but car manufacturing was turned from a relatively impersonal process in which people had no particular interest in what they're doing, to one in which a particular car was being turned out as the object of craft skills, and craft skills shared by a team, and a team that worked together and that took great pride in how well they worked together. This was something that happened at a time. This is long gone. This sort of consideration is relevant. But time and again, you will find in the history of manufacturing contrasts between workplaces in which people have discovered a way in which making things in an excellent way becomes the common good of the workplace, and everything else is subordinated to that common good. And that's when you get interesting workplaces.
Thank you, Professor MacIntyre, for your paper. My question is actually just more the speculative part of your paper. You mentioned how our being part of the universe should have some implications for how we see ourselves as part of the political community. That's a provocative statement. I think you even go down the line that our being part of the city, has implications for how we're parts of the family and how we're parts of the family, how we pursue our own particular good. The medieval scene, minus its representative, no problems with this notion. You see its notion suffuses St. Thomas's moral theology. It seems like our own contemporaries, though, this is a real problem, or at least a lost notion. In fact, you had 20th century Catholics, which you mentioned, one of them who argued specifically against the person as part, how those two notions are opposed to each other. In your opinion, how serious is the loss of the notion of the person as part for the project that you propose? And do you have any thoughts as to how, in the contemporary moment, the recovery of this notion might be achieved?
It's very important that I stand in a different relationship to others who are members of the same political community that I am. And I'm understanding this notion of a political community in a rather strong sense. But people who are my day-to-day neighbors, people with whom I have to cooperate in doing all sorts of things, it's very easy to ask, what's our common good? But we all of us have to interact all the time with relative strangers. And we need to deliberate together with them. What Aquinas' doctrine tells us is that we share a common good with them. It may be much more difficult to find out what that particular common good is in a particular instance, though very often if we are in fact thrust together with strangers, then we can ask this. Now, this has become a hard practical question these days with the flow of immigrants and refugees that is now taking place. One of the huge changes in political society in various parts of the world now is the movement of peoples. There hasn't been a movement like it for centuries, right? And this means that continually people are encountering strangers. And what is it that they are, how are they and these strangers to deliberate together about what is to be done? And you've only got to look at the way in which, for example, Greece has been made to bear the burden of the arrival of strangers from the Middle East to an extent which suggests that, as it were, at this point, not only have these immigrants from the Middle East been wronged, but also the Greeks have been wronged in having all this put on them. So the question of how we are related as parts to a larger whole is actually a practical question. Is that clear so far? The other thing I want to say is don't romanticize the Middle Ages. First of all, because Aquinas was a marginal figure intellectually in his own time. And secondly, one of the things that, one of the most interesting pieces of historical research that I've read is about the debates that went on in the community at Chartres about the building of the cathedral, where the question of for whom the cathedral was, what the common good of the community at Chartres was, who would be allowed to use the cathedral for purposes, for traders to use it for buying and selling. In fact, it became the provision of a place for town meetings, among other things. But if you go through those debates, and debates between the town and the local landowner and so on, you can see that there is certainly a notion of the common good presupposed in a great deal, but it's about as difficult to achieve as it often is for us. And you don't want to be particularly romantic about it.
So as you likely know, Roger Ayers' book on the Benedict options came out a few days ago. In his book, he supports your visions of focusing on different associations and town governance, but lacks your broader critique of inequality and social injustice. I was wondering what your view of this movement, which claims to be inspired by after virtue, is, and can we pursue local goods, especially local goods of parishes, churches, without drawing from concern for the broader common good of our society or nation?
Well, let me make one thing clear. The so-called Benedict option movement, insofar as it is inspired by anything to do with me, is inspired by one sentence I read. And the people who put it forward have apparently read nothing but that one sentence. That is a sentence in which I suggest that we have been waiting for a new St. Benedict. So let me say what I meant by this, because it is bearing on what you're saying. What is very interesting about Benedict is that he quite inadvertently created a new set of social forms. Inadvertently. He founded a monastic order. And one thing about this monastic order was they had to survive to make their living, so they had to be farmers, right? So we have monks who are farmers. Now, the interesting thing about monks is they don't breed. They can't reproduce themselves. That if you simply had monks going out into the wilderness and farming, there soon wouldn't be. So there have to be non-monks around, right? And this is what always happened. A Benedictine community existed in a set of villages very often very close to one of them, sometimes to a set of them. And then it had a crucial symbiotic relationship with this. First of all, they were all farmers, and so they engaged in the exchanges that farmers did. They had an economic network. Secondly, it was from the sons of the villagers that novices were found. And the monks therefore had a keen interest in the education of the community. And so over time, the monastery became the place that supplied schooling and liturgy. And the villages provided lay recruits and so on. But what you got built up was a kind of local community, which note was largely independent of the feudal order. Not entirely, but very much so. So this is not a withdrawal from society into isolation of a certain sort. This is actually the creation of a new set of social institutions that then proceeded to evolve, and a very interesting set of social institutions too. And later on, when you get collisions with the feudal order in all sorts of ways, and that becomes interesting too. So when I said we needed a new St. Benedict, what I was suggesting was we needed a new kind of engagement with the social order, not any kind of withdrawal from it. I should add, by the way, that it's also the case that by and large people who put forward this appear to have conservative views politically, and I am well known for holding that conservatism and liberalism are mirror images of one another, and that one should have nothing to do with either of them. Any issue posed in terms of the relation between them. I mean, the moment you think of yourself as a liberal or a conservative, you're done for. It's as simple as that.
There's time for one more question. Go ahead, Bruce.
Does politics common good require grace? And specifically thinking about what you were saying about desire, the role of desire, and the ordering desire in the politics of the common good. If sin is about this sort of desire, how does grace fit into this vision?
Good. Here, the crucial text of Aquinas is in the disputed question on the virtues. And Aquinas suggests that there are three levels at which one may exhibit the virtues. There's a first level at which one may have particular virtues, but they're not, as it were, organized together at all. They're not unified. So one's just in this aspect of one's life, one's courageous in that. But this is a rather low level, and it's compatible with being a failure in respect of the virtues in all sorts of ways. Go to the next level is when the virtues are organized by prudence, by practical intelligence, by phronesis. And now this is a much more integral kind of moral life, but it is again one that is never wholly successful. People are invariably defective in this or that respect in the virtues. And so we move to the third level, where the governing virtue is no longer prudence but charity. And charity one has only by grace. And it is extremely important that it is only in and through charity that one begins to exhibit other virtues as they should be exhibited. It isn't the case that if you have charity, you won't still be vicious in all sorts of ways. I mean, this is extremely important, that you may in fact be saintly in many respects and not in others. And it's very important that this is so. But it is important that we need an account of sin if we are to explain why we fail in the virtues in the ways that we do and the degrees that we do. And that this is an unchangeable feature of human life. And that we also need an account of grace in order to explain how it is possible for us to, on occasion at least, transcend these limitations and achieve a level of virtuous living that is beyond our normal power. I used to have a colleague, a philosophical colleague, a very distinguished philosopher, who, when asked whether he believed the Christian religion or any other would say, no, he didn't believe at all, but I do, he said, believe in grace. And what he meant by this was that he thought that there were many occasions in human life when people behaved in ways that transcended their ordinary limitations in such a striking way that you didn't know what to say. And he saw this as a point at which, on his view, we're simply baffled. I take it it's part of the task of theology to explain why grace operates as it does in human life, and that at this point, this is needed, both an account of sin and an account of grace is needed to complete the account of the virtues. The virtues, this account remains incomplete until we've done this. Does this move towards answering your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think the puzzle I always have is that it seems like when we have these kinds of conversations about the common good, we often assume kind of something like a secular discourse about, talking about cities and schools and those kinds of things, and trying to understand how grace fits in, the reality of grace fits into those kinds of conversations, which are pursuit of goods in common in mixed communities.
Well, let me say two things. First is, yes, we do need a secular account of what it is to pursue the common good, because in fact, we are going to have to give good political reasons for doing this rather than that to people of many faiths and none. Politics is a secular activity, and it has to be pursued as a secular activity. When it's not pursued as a secular activity, the results are usually disastrous. So we need an account that is secular and that can be presented in wholly secular terms. But no account of any aspect of human life in purely secular, rational terms can explain the way in which human life is invaded by evils. And this is one of the things that the furthest we can go in secular argument is to note this. Hence, the thing that I wanted to emphasize in my paper is that no discussion of common goods which does not understand the role of defect and evil and lack in political life is going to work. Now, we can't go any further than that without revealed truth.
Please join me in thanking Professor